Welcome and thank you for joining us today. This is Road to COP28, Africa's Priorities, Goals and Vision. Your moderator today is Dhesigen Naidoo, Senior Research Associate, Institute for Security Studies. Please keep your microphones and cameras turned off until we reach the question and answer portion for today's event. The question and answer session will be conducted using both the chat function and the raise hand function on your Zoom application. To access the chat function, kindly scroll to the bottom of your Zoom application, click on the chat button, and a chat box will appear. Should you wish to raise your hand, kindly click on the reactions button to access the raise hand function. During the question and answer session, the moderator will acknowledge you, and you will have to unmute your own microphone and turn your own camera on to make your comment or ask your question. Please note, we will evaluate this event using an online poll. The evaluation is completely anonymous, and it helps us to present better events in future. Kindly do take a moment to complete it. It'll be launched following the presentations portion for today's event. As we wait for our final participants to connect their audio, we kindly remind you to please keep your microphones muted and your cameras turned off until we reach the Q&A portion for today. Please also note that since this is a public event being broadcast live on YouTube, Chatham House rule does not apply. This is Road to COP28, Africa's Priorities, Goals and Vision. Dhesigen, you have the floor.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this ISS dialogue. And we're quite thrilled that you're able to join us. We have a very interesting lineup today, and we will introduce all of the folk to you very shortly. But I thought I would start out with a few introductory notes to introduce where we are. My name is Dhesigen Naidoo, and the hat I'm wearing this morning is the Institute for Security Studies, and quite specifically the Climate Risk and Human Security Project. We are in an interesting place in the world. The world is in a crisis, and we see this all around us, and it is expressed on an almost daily basis. And the various facets of these crises that make up the global crisis all demand a very particular way in which we engage it. And the crisis in the world roughly has three legs currently. One is we are not far away from a deepening economic crisis in the world. Our inability to recover sufficiently from COVID, and some argue our inability to sufficiently recover from the 2008 crisis, continues to be a hangover for the global economy. In addition to that, we have a global security crisis. Some would argue that we are at war, that the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza are the latest installments in this saga, but the continued instability as the world reorganizes itself into a new equilibrium around multipolarity from a unipolarity 2 or 3 decades is something we are clearly struggling with in the world. And the third crisis, both on its own, as well as a significant threat multiplier to the other two, is the climate crisis. And that's what we want to delve into a lot more deeply today. The reality is that the world is in dire straits with regards to climate. After mourning the lack of ratification of Kyoto for many years, new life was breathed into the system in 2015 when we had the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement held a huge promise around us resurrecting the agenda, moving and our best efforts forward to keep below 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. The reality around that is that it's not happening, and it's not happening at the kind of rate that we want to. The global stocktake, which is going to be examined in a lot more detail at COP28, is quite clear that out of the 42 targets in the Paris Agreement, only one is going to be able to be achieved in the time frame that is prescribed based on our current movement, which means on 41 of the targets, we are off course. The other thing around this is that we're already at 1.15 degrees above pre-industrial levels as our temperature increase. And its impacts have been absolutely devastating. We have extreme weather events all over the world, and the disaster map of climate-related disasters globally, one is pervasive. That is its first characteristic. There are no regions in the world anymore that are immune from it. Two, the intensity of those events are unbelievable. It has gone up exponentially. And the third is the regularity. We are now seeing these events almost annually in some parts of the world, many times inside the same year. The pegs that we once had around these frequencies, for example, a certain level of flood, which was pegged at 1 in 120 years in many parts of the world, including where I'm talking to you from today, which is South Africa, it is an occurrence that happens almost every year. We see that sometimes in the same country, you will have high energy storms, floods, and drought, and heat waves, all operating inside the same system. The impact on the seas with sea level rise and temperature increases and the acidification of the seas have huge impacts in their own right. In addition to that, we have this relationship between climate crises and forced mobility or migration of people on the back of climate change, as well as an increase in incidents of violence, conflict, and sometimes even wars in certain parts of the world. So we are really in dire straits. But in Africa, we're looking at this in a way that is maybe a little bit different from elsewhere in the world. The first thing to acknowledge is that the climate dialogue has become a dialogue about much more than climate. That globally, the climate dialogue, which is punctuated every year by the Conference of the Parties, and we are preparing in this seminar to work our way towards next month, which is COP28 in Dubai, is one that is a pressure test for multilateralism. Does the multilateralism system work? Does it work in the form that it currently is? Can we organize for the climate agenda to not only get the benefit from the expressions of multilateral aspirations from the different countries so that we actually can get these agreements to move into implementation more rapidly, but also, can the climate dialogue help us to re-knit the multilateral system, to potentiate the multilateral system to be more effective in a whole range of other domains? The second is that the climate dialogue has been the point at which the expressions, the more robust expressions around the need for the reform of the global financial system has been particularly robust. While certain individuals stand out, like Mia Motley, and her introduction into the dialogue of the Bridgetown Agenda, I think there's a general consensus among the leadership in the world, both political leadership and business leadership and civil society leadership, that not only is there a high need for the change in the global financial system, the rate of that change needs to be much more rapid. And the third thing to put out is that the climate dialogue globally has become a marker of the global inequality, the thing that this UN Secretary General said was the real pandemic in the world today, the global inequality. And climate is pushing this notion of greater equality in the system, a fairer set of rules at play, better access to resources, if you like, to export a very African concept globally to talk about Ubuntu, in this case specifically climate Ubuntuism. So as I round up my opening remarks, I'm going to put two things on the plate. First, what we're talking about today. Africa and its prominence in the COP discussions have been encouragingly higher in profile over the last few COPs. There are a few African countries that have always been prominent in the debate, right from when it started in 1995. But it's quite clear that the continent as a whole is having much more influence on both the shape of the agenda and some of its outcomes. At the Africa COP, which is what we named it last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, Africa was a principal driver around getting the issue of loss and damage to a higher profile, and we have an unprecedented agreement on the formation of a loss and damage fund, a critical point for most of the developing world and even some parts of the developed world, actually. And while we are grumbling about the interim modalities, and we will finalize this over time, we must acknowledge the role that Africa has played. The second, in the way that Africa is organizing its agency around engaging the COPs, we have many markers that are telling us that we are moving in a really good direction around global leadership inside this domain. So the expression that was made earlier this year, when President Ruto of Kenya, the current chair of the Committee of African Heads of State on Climate Change, hosting the inaugural African Climate Summit and putting out the Nairobi Declaration as a unified vision for the positioning of Africa in the COP28 discussion, has been a huge milestone. So colleagues, we are really looking forward to the discussion today. We have assembled with us a Pan-African leadership of note to engage this issue from a variety of disciplines. And we will, during the course of this morning, in the short 2 hours that we have, try to get to some depth in the debate. In particular, we want to refresh on how we are thinking about the future of the climate dialogue as Africans. We want to express our aspirations around what we want to see, both at COP28, specifically in Dubai in December, but also in this presidency year of the UAE 2024, and of course beyond. We also want to be quite candid about the challenges that are clearly in the system, and we want to put our best foot forward around how we address those challenges. So colleagues, I want to introduce the first speaker, because in the way we're working today, we're going to have 2 framing presentations up front, and then we're going to have a very vibrant panel that will engage us, as well as the Q&A following that. So Brian Mantlana, he's a commissioner in the Presidential Climate Commission in South Africa. He's also the head of the climate division of the CSIR, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa, South Africa's biggest RDI institution by far. And he's going to offer us a framing of UNFCCC COP28, both the challenges and the opportunities to stimulate our discussion. Brian, I'm handing over to you.
Yes, thanks, Dhesigen. Can you just confirm that you can hear me once more?
We can definitely hear you.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to give this input this morning. I'm Brian, I'm based in Pretoria, and I'm going to be brief. I'm going to talk about few points, mainly my perspectives, and I want to be clear here, it's my perspectives around the COP process. Dhesigen implied this in his introductory remarks that the chessboard of international diplomacy is always in movement. We are seeing fragmentation of the global system. That fragmentation is leading to a transition which is very difficult to characterize at the moment. What I'm picking up, though, for me is what I call multi-alignment. An Indian scholar friend of mine calls it friends with benefits. It's a multi-alignment between or among developing countries and between North and South. It's just that transition is very difficult to characterize. But for me, this multi-alignment that's taking shape seems to be a de-risking strategy for many countries as we are transitioning from what we know that as the unipolar world to this yet to take shape multipolar world system. But so much about that. I want to talk about 4 things this morning. One, I want to reflect on the host country of the COP. Then I want to talk about where are we in the global climate governance? Where are we? Can we just have a few moments to reflect on that? And then want to just look forward a little bit and say what could be the main packages of the COP28 deal. And then I want to talk about Africa's engagement. Firstly, about the host country. The Middle East countries are generally known as, how do I put it politely, slow movers in the multilateral process of climate change. The biggest player in the region is usually Saudi Arabia. But the countries in that region are feeling the pressure from abroad to do something about their dependency on fossil fuels. What's not obvious to me is whether this pressure is political or is economic. But that pressure definitely exists. I just want to remind you colleagues that there is an understudied relationship in the climate change negotiations. And that understudied relationship, for me, understudied relationship, is the relationship between USA and the Arab states. You don't find a lot written about that relationship in the context of the multilateral process of climate change. But there's a dynamic there that I think we should not lose sight of. I do not have time to give you my views on it, but it's something that I think is important when you talk about the host country aspects for this COP. I'm going to leave it there, Dhesigen, for on the first part of the host country. Then I'm going to move to where are we in global climate governance? Remember, currently, we are implementing what we call as the pledge and review system. This is what we got from Paris Agreement. It's the political capital that existed. That's what we could get. It's inclusion, it's softer obligations, it's softer enforcement. So that's what we are implementing currently, the pledge and review system. What are we seeing in the past few years? The first obvious observation for me is the global mitigation project is failing. I want to repeat that. I'm repeating it not because it's true, because it's my perspective. The global mitigation project is failing. It's failing not out of lack of effort. There is a lot happening, but it is failing. It is very difficult to prove that we can decouple economic growth from an increase in GHG emissions. Providing that evidence is becoming elusive. I think another thing we didn't expect as observers of this process is that obtaining specific GHG reduction commitments from emerging developing economies has become more difficult than we anticipated. To get these commitments, to get them honored, has become very difficult for emerging developing countries. Whilst these countries are essential to reduce global GHG emissions, it's evident that their preference is what I call grow first, clean up later. I do not think that's entirely accurate, but if you are not looking at rhetoric and you are looking at actions, there are elements of that say these developing countries are very keen on their growth, economic growth, and they're doing that, trying to do that in a clean manner. So that there's a tension there that is highly evident. Most importantly, though, the failure of this global mitigation project is what's pertinent for Africa. It's got grave consequences for what I call the global majority. Some people call it the global South. The failure of the global mitigation project is something that we in the African climate community need to unpack the consequences of it and begin to grapple with it intentionally and explicitly. The other issue I want to highlight that is evident in this pledge and review period we are in is the issue of transferring of responsibility for climate action from developed countries to developing countries. That project is succeeding. The project of transferring responsibility from developed to developing countries is succeeding. I think we need to take cognizance of that. Let me give you just obvious examples. If you go to Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, there's something there called Enhanced Transparency Framework. But most observers in literature do point out that the enhanced component of the transparency framework of the Paris Agreement is primarily enhanced for developing countries, is fairly much business as usual for developed countries. If you go to the finance conversation, there's a strong push by the developed countries to include emerging developing countries as sources of climate finance. To me, that's another sign of transferring of responsibility. There are many logical, legitimate reasons for that conversation of sources of finance. But from the perspective of who's responsible, the transfer of responsibility is increasingly moving towards the global south. We know about the strong pressure to be more ambitious, in particular by developing countries in reduction of GHG emissions. That pressure, we're going to see it at this COP. We're going to see it next year when we are revising the NDCs. There's another subtle but very strong aspect of the transfer of responsibility. Is the role of the private sector versus the role of the state in responding to climate change. Often the developed countries will tell us that the private sector's role should be enhanced. Implicit in that is that the role of the state is limited. What that means, it brings in barriers of aspects like technology transfer to be handled in a space that's outside the multilateral process. And that has a big effect on this transfer of responsibility again. So those are the key points that I just wanted to talk about when it comes to this issue of transfer of responsibility. That to me, it's clear that the burden of responding to climate change is shifting toward the global south. I leave it to you if you agree or not. The other thing I'd like us to reflect on is the agency of the European Union. The European Union has played a critical role in the global climate response. I personally have a huge respect of the role the EU has played. But what is clear to me is that the EU is not able or is unlikely, despite its pushing ahead on climate policy, but it's unlikely to motivate the United States to follow its path on climate policy. It is either unlikely or it's unable, or both, to persuade US to move in the similar trajectory in climate policy. And that is material. Secondly, for me, I find the role of the EU when it comes to key aspects of African interest tentative. I find the EU tentative. For example, I find them not, this is my personal view, that they are not totally committed to the loss and damage discussion. My view is that they are hiding behind the US in that discussion. Although the rhetoric is that it's an important aspect, but I find that there is not enough that the EU is doing in the loss and to advance the loss and damage discussion. To be blunt, I find them in the same corner as US when it comes to loss and damage, but it's advancing a slightly different rhetoric. And I'm at the stage where I've stopped looking at what countries say, but at what countries do. If I had more time, I would explain this further. The other aspect that is very important in the COP process are the driving forces that are beyond the state, the civil society, the science policy interface, the public opinion. Here, Dhesigen, I just have one point to make. The first set of countries that invest in educating their countries about climate change in the global south, they will be the first beneficiaries of whatever happens in the global climate response. The level of awareness, the level of education, the level of training on climate change issues is critical as a global climate response, is as critical as any other thing that we are doing in responding to climate change. Lastly, I want to talk about, second last, the Africa engagement at COP28. I mean, within the African group, we are different. Those that are not Africans, they treat us as a country. Africa has never been a country and is not a country. So there will always be differences in how we perceive and how we advance our agendas as African countries amongst ourselves. Egypt will never be like Lesotho. They are both in Africa. So there will always be differences in interests of the different countries. But I want to highlight two things that I think I would help the agency of Africa at this COP and in the next 2 or 3 COPs. The first one is, how do we build high trust networks? How do we go out, turn ourselves away from networks that are high fear and build high trust networks? A month ago, not even a month ago, a few weeks ago, Saudi Arabia invited African leaders to Saudi Arabia, to Riyadh. That is a telling statement. And in my view, the African climate response needs to update itself about global developments and ask, how do we build high trust networks that work for Africa? I do not have an answer to that, but for me, I think that we need to update how we engage with our partners, in particular, our global South partners as a region. The second aspect for me is, how do we go big and bold on adaptation as Africa? We've been saying adaptation is important for Africa. How do we go big and bold? And for me, the biggest, the trigger to that is, how can we develop economic incentives? How can we develop economic incentives for adaptation actions? I sense that we are struggling to close this gap of economic incentives and adaptation actions. How do we reduce the cost of adaptation? All the reports give us big numbers of the cost of adaptation. I find that useful, but also not useful. So we need to ask ourselves, how do we deal with the cost of adaptation as the continent? I just want to remind ourselves that one of the assets that we have in Africa is our demographics. How do we use that to our advantage? There's an underrepresented conversation in the UNFCCC about education, awareness, and capacity building. It's a big deal for Africa. Education, awareness, capacity building. If we get that right in the next 5 to 10 years, we then can weaponize our demographics. I'm using that word here carefully. But it can be, our demographics would really be our strength if we equip them with this training on climate change. Lastly, what could be the main packages of the COP28 deal? Well, for me, there are 4 things. First, to say the finance discussion is not ripe for movement at the moment. I don't think the time is ripe for making progress on climate finance. So I'm not having much expectation on it. I think there will be a lot of noise. I expect a lot of noise, as we've done in the past 2 COPs. But I think the political appetite is not there for material progress on climate finance. There are three areas that I think will be part of the deal at COP28. The first one is that countries next year have to update their NDCs. This comes after the GST report that painted a very gloomy picture about where we are in terms of global GHG emissions reductions. So I expect a strongly worded mitigation ambition language coming out of this COP, a language that strongly says we need more ambition on mitigation, we need more action. Second issue is the momentum from COP27 on two aspects, on loss and damage and on global goal on adaptation. I expect that this presidency will find it easier to maintain that momentum, and it's got a great opportunity to advance those two topics on loss and damage and on global goal on adaptation. So I expect that the package for this COP to be very strong on those two aspects. So I'm going to leave it there, Dhesigen. I've got lots to say, but I don't want to take up too much time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. We will have you back again later to have that engagement. And thank you so much for what have been very thoughtful remarks and some of those things that are not in the usual dialogue that we have around climate change. Very grateful for that. Colleagues, we're going to go straight on now to Professor Guy Midgley. Guy is a well-established scientist in this domain, specializing in aspects of ecosystems, and he will tell you a little bit more about that. He is also currently the director of the School of Climate at the University of Stellenbosch. Guy, over to you. We see your presentation. It is in the right mode, but we're not hearing you.
Yes, here we go. I figured it out finally. Des, thanks very much to you and the rest of the team for the invitation to speak. It's a real honor to be able to do so. Lovely to see you, Brian. We worked together for many years in the early 2000s. And there's nothing I disagree with that Brian has said. I think you made some excellent points. I do think, to start off with, that this burden shifting idea, Brian, you've got it correct. I think it's been a major concession by the Global South in the negotiations, but we don't talk about it as a concession. And we should do so, because having made the concession to participate very transparently, we're not getting any benefits, or we're not getting enough benefits from participating in what is really a global team game. Solving the climate crisis is a team game. Africa and African countries need to be strong players in the team game. But we have to make use of all the perspectives that we have at our fingertips. And one of them is to say, we've conceded and we're participating. We need others to come to the party. The second main point I want to make is we can negotiate with each other, but we cannot negotiate with nature. And we like to talk about negotiations as if this is all negotiable. But there's one big non-negotiable, and that is what nature is doing. So let me give you some perspectives on that from a particularly African perspective. Let me see if I can move on. So I just got to figure out how to do this. There we go. Brian, I agree with you. Africa is often viewed as a country by some. It is a complex continent, many countries with many different national circumstances. And this graph from the Africa chapter of the IPCC shows just the differential distribution of population across this vast continent. Each country has its own interests, and that is one of the challenges that we face in negotiating as Africa. But one thing that is very important about this region is that it is rapidly urbanizing. This is a huge developmental shift that's taking place, and it represents both a risk and an opportunity. But think of the massive opportunity that this pattern represents. I would also argue that while this is occurring and is projected to continue to occur, it is a sustainable development opportunity. This urbanization must be made climate resilient, both in terms of mitigation and in terms of adaptation. So we need, as a continent, to understand these big shifts that are happening in development across our continent and how we can make use of them in the climate context. The Southern African region, often sold as a basket case, I think is a very, very incorrect view. Also offers a massive opportunity. Brian, you spoke about our demographic advantage. We're one of the few regions in the world with a healthy, young, developing population. There are many parts of the world whose demographies are condemning them to economic contraction. This is not true for our region, Southern Africa. Most of our demographics are approaching a replacement rate. We have slowly increasing economic development, particularly in Southern Africa. So the context here for us is, ironically, as we approach a sustainable development trajectory, climate change starts to threaten our futures. What are the big risks that Africa faces? This goes to my point that we cannot negotiate with nature. The recent IPCC report on Africa shows on the left-hand panel that there is indubitable proof that Africa is already experiencing the impacts of climate change. Those pink areas of Africa are areas where there is evidence that anthropogenic climate change is having adverse effects. Now, if we go to the right-hand set of graphs, that shows projections for Africa of what future warming would do and what sort of risks lie in wait for us. And you can see biodiversity, human mortality, and food production. All of these things face imminent risks as we rise above 1.5 degrees. And as Dhesigen said, we've knocked on that door. That ship is rapidly sailing. So what is in Africa's interest? Well, there are two things. Mitigation and adaptation, as Brian has said. It's vital for Africa that the mitigation project succeed because it will greatly reduce risks to all of our countries. But at the same time, we have to be able to adapt because there's global warming in the pipeline, as I'll show. So both those things are important. And interestingly, for the loss and damage discussion, increased adaptation funding will reduce the risks of loss and damage. So this is in everybody's interests. We must understand these big picture interests for African countries. Mitigation is vital. Adaptation and avoiding loss and damage is vital. We have a very, very strong case to make on finance for both of these aspects. What is happening and why has there been such a radical increase in pressure from the international community? Well, there's new evidence, and I want to say that while the IPCC is highly effective, the cycle of IPCC reports is too slow now to keep up with new knowledge on climate. And what we're seeing is that new information coming out from new satellites is showing us that in addition to the rising CO2, ocean temperatures, etc., just the global energy balance is moving in the wrong direction. And it is committing us to further rapid warming, as has been shown by Jim Hansen in his recent paper, Global Warming in the Pipeline. This is subsequent to the IPCC report. And this analysis shows us that mitigation, we don't have much carbon space left, if any. If you use certain assumptions, we are committed to very, very significant future warming over the next few years and decades. So this is nature is not a negotiator. It sets the rules. We're seeing things like rising methane emissions, scary patterns from the ice parts of the world. There is huge pressure now, and impacts, particularly in Northern Hemisphere countries, are really starting to bite. So what's happening? Well, Brian, as you said, a huge expansion in the private carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets. And it's almost like the Wild West in many ways. There is so much new pressure to find the carbon stores, areas of carbon sequestration. And as Africa, we need to really understand what's going on, because there are changes afoot and pressure for African countries to contribute to carbon sequestration, carbon dioxide removal. We need to understand these better. It represents an opportunity, but also a major risk. I'll quickly give you one example. The risk of unbridled and inappropriate afforestation risks many African ecosystems. People who want to plant trees in some of our unique savannas and grasslands, it's not going to achieve anything. And it's going to cause untold harm to ecosystems and African livelihoods for generations to come. But there's a massive amount of money behind it. I know that the debate is shifting internationally and these efforts are becoming more responsible. But this is just one example of how we, as an African continent, need to understand the risks that are inherent in this massive rush for carbon credits. Brian, you mentioned the NDCs. I just want to get to the close with a perspective. This is an analysis, recent analysis on the cost of implementing NDCs in different regions of Africa. And it shows that there is a significant finance need. But what I want to show is that our NDCs are very biased towards mitigation investment. And adaptation at the moment represents 24% of finance needs. This cannot be true. It's likely underestimated due to a lack of data and technical expertise to estimate the true cost. Why? What is the problem? Why can't we estimate the true cost? Well, one reason is that global investment in climate research is appallingly low into Africa. This is also from Chris Drissos et al.'s Africa chapter. Please download it and read it. It's full of powerful information. Negotiators need to have this off pat if they're negotiating. But the graph on the left shows world investment in climate research versus investment into Africa. What proportion goes to Africa is the brown line at the bottom. Africa stands at the back of the queue. This is an appalling inequity. It's wrong. It's so wrong. And our negotiators need to fight harder, because it's this information that will allow us to argue on the global stage as a strong player in the team game. What is the consequence? Well, the consequence, if you look at the right-hand panel, is that African countries push much more of their own meager resources into climate change research than the rest of the world. Look at the brown line versus the blue line there on the right. That is a consequence of a lack of investment. The finance discussion has to advance much faster to allow African countries to participate as a strong player. I don't want to make many more points, but I just wanted to inject those views. I'm not going to come to any conclusions, but I hope that these views will help to stimulate some debate. Thank you very much for listening.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really brilliant and a lot of food for thought. And some of the drivers around things that haven't really been in the center of the radar. And the introduction of a completely new term, one at least I haven't heard before, malmitigation. I talk to everyone and everyone's aunt about maladaptation, but yeah, I see where you're going. Colleagues, we will have Guy back a bit later in the discussion. Brian, unfortunately, has to go and be an administrator for a while, and hopefully he will be able to join us later on. We're now getting to that pretty exciting part of the program where you've had these extraordinary inputs, I think, around the African perspective and the challenges and the opportunities for Africa in the COP space. I'm now going to hand over to my colleagues, Ilan Tahir and Amy Noel, and they're going to take us through the panel and the discussion. Ladies, over to you.
All right. Thanks very much, Dhesigen, and thank you to both Brian and to Guy for really great opening remarks that we hope to build on. We've got three panelists with us today. Each are very esteemed experts in their own field, and we're really happy to be able to have leaders like these. Each sort of deserves keynote space, but instead we're going to give each of them about 5 to 8 minutes to answer some key questions and each of them is going to talk a little bit about what Africa's priorities are going to be going into COP28 in their specific areas of expertise, and then put some thought into how we can go about strengthening Africa's priorities and negotiation position throughout COP28. Following that, we're going to open it up to some questions from the audience. So if you have any questions as the panelists are discussing, if you can kindly put those into the the chat function, and we will go from there. Alternatively, if you prefer, then you can raise a hand and we can call on you. So you've got the two options, but if you're able to put them in the chat, then we can sort of group them together and make sure they get targeted at the right panelist. I'll hand it to Ilhan.
Thank you, Amy Noel. So the first of our panelists is Ms. Alice Rueza from the WWF. She's an international development and sustainability expert and a senior director on policy influence and engagement at the WWF. And we're very happy to have her here today, especially considering your background, Ms. Rueza. I'm curious what you think are the chances of COP28 resulting in a successful global stocktake. This is really central to many of the discussions we've been having leading up to COP28, and I know it's outlined as an essential outcome by the WWF. So I'm curious if you have some optimism around that or what the state of play is. I'm also curious from your perspective what the priority outcomes for COP28 besides this will be, and if you think that there is something in particular that we can really hope to gain from the convenings this year. You have around 5 minutes to speak, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you so much, and good to be here. I'm battling a little bit of a cold here in very cold Nairobi. So I think, the previous speakers have really laid it all out very nicely. I feel like there's almost nothing I can add to what they've said. And of course, you ask me very tough questions in terms of what do I think is the chance of success. I'm a natural optimist. So I believe, I go into COP28 believing that we are all going there and we have some goodwill to get this done. Sharm el-Sheikh, we called Sharm el-Sheikh the COP of implementation. And now we're calling this one the COP of climate credibility. And for us at WWF, we are really, really pushing for a dramatic course correction to reset climate action in line with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. But of course, I recognize all the issues. I think Dhesigen laid out very clearly where we are in the world and all the wars and all the issues. And I think Brian also laid out really nicely the other challenges in the system. But I guess, nevertheless, we continue to be hopeful. For us, 6 things, of course, that we are looking for. I will talk about what our global expectations are, but then I'll also talk about our Africa ones. Globally, we're really looking for a successful global stocktake that paves the way for stronger NDCs to correct costs to 1.5. We're looking for a decision to phase out fossil fuels no later than 2050. I think Brian noted that it's an interesting, tricky situation with the host country this time having strong dependence on fossil fuels. Nevertheless, we feel that has given us an opportunity to actually put this on the table and to discuss it. Thirdly, we are looking for full operationalization of the loss and damage fund with pledged funds. The discussions have been very tricky leading up to this, and we're hoping that we can push more. We're looking for a decision. The fourth one is a decision in the comprehensive framework for the global goal on adaptation. I think Guy has made it very clear we need adaptation. He talked about mitigation as well, but I think adaptation continues to be important. This has been on the agenda for a while, so we need to see some movement. The fifth is finance, of course. I think that came up very much in finance, and Brian laid out very clearly the different issues, the lack of commitment here and there. But nevertheless, we continue to push. I did read somewhere that the 100 million that was promised has finally been met. I don't know, but maybe something to look at. And then the last one is the alignment of all private and public financial flows with climate objectives. So the reform of the financial architecture, the Bridgetown initiative that Dhesigen talked about. So really pushing for that. So for Africa, our Africa team actually has put together 10 asks for that. I know I don't have enough time to go through them, but they're very similar. Obviously, we're eager for better results. We just came off a very brilliant Africa Climate Summit, I have to say. And I felt that in that summit, we started to change our narrative and really push forward Africa as a continent of solutions. So no longer the victim of climate change that needs to be, supported and all of that. We're not losing that, but we're also putting ourselves forward as a continent of solutions. And I'm hoping that we continue with that agency going into this COP. I think Brian did lay out that he has seen strong agency from Africa. I believe that, and I think it will continue. So 10 asks, and I'll go through them very quickly. Of course, the strength and implementation of the new NDCs, that's an important one. Implementation being the very important word. Ambition, of course, scaled up ambition being another one. The second one, bring the primacy of adaptation, more urgent than ever. And I think Guy put up the money, we really need an estimated 579.2 billion in adaptation finance. So we need to identify, prioritize, and mainstream adaptation into development policy making. We need to stress the further elaboration of adaptation planning and implementation. As of October, only 18 countries have submitted their national adaptation plans. So we need to see that go also, ramp up. Advocate for stronger commitments and action on adaptation finance. I've said that. And then pledge for the implementation of large-scale nature-based solutions for adaptation. So we're going to be pushing that agenda as well. The global stocktake that was mentioned. So, and everybody has talked about the fact that it's, shows really dire. It shows we're a long way off. And but we also see it as an opportunity for Africa to showcase its contributions to curbing climate change by underscoring our significant natural resources, our critical minerals that we talked about, our forests, our grasslands, as a solution to these issues that came out of the global stocktake. Loss and damage funds, the fourth one is that facility. We've talked about that. It's also in the Nairobi Declaration adopted by our leaders at the Africa Climate Summit. We need that to be operationalized, and we need pledges. Tangible finance commitments, again, I mentioned that, nothing really more to add. We only received 30 billion of the climate financing. I think Guy put the figures up there. Clearly, we need to see more and more financing. In fact, as a continent that is open for business, I believe President Ruto, who is the president of Kenya and the chair of the Heads of State Committee on Climate Change, talked a lot about this and says that we're a continent of solutions, but we need to make sure that we can access investments, at a much cheaper rate, the interest rates are, and also we need to get our debt forgiveness. Food system, this didn't come out. I don't know if that came out with the previous speakers, but it's also something we're pushing. And interestingly, the COP28 has put food, there's a food day there, and of course a nature day, which is also very good. So we're obviously going to be looking to advance those discussions on food systems. We started a little bit in Sharm el-Sheikh, didn't get as much in the Coronavia work program, but this time with a really, really strong, very, very strong support from the COP28 team, we're seeing a good focus. And in fact, there was just in UK, a global summit also hosted by the UK government and the UAE government. So, but pushing, going beyond agriculture, but to really look across all food systems, looking at smallholders and indigenous people. Those are going to be some of the issues we push. Renewable energy, phasing out fossil fuels, big discussion for us. Affordable energy access, because the energy access discussion sometimes gets lost, and for us it's very important. We still hear that figure of 600 million people lacking basic access. I don't know if this number is ever going to change, but we need to push for this as well. And then we talked about the nature-based solutions and strengthening that narrative on nature. And lastly, and the guy also talked about this, the demographic dividend, the youth. For us, our youthful population is a an asset, and we need to harness it for climate action. We're seeing their voices improve much more. They're seeing louder voices on this, and we're going to be supporting more and more of the youth to really play a strong role in advocating for climate action and pushing their governments for more political will. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. I had a quick follow-up based on something you said that I think will be really important ahead of COP28 about large-scale nature-based solutions for adaptation. I'm curious if there are any specific initiatives that we should be keeping an eye on as a continent or anything of note in that domain, because I think that's the type of solution-based approach that we should be looking forward to discussing further.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the large-scale, one of some of the two large-scale programs we have are the AFR 100. As you know, it's I believe 20-something countries pledging restoration for 100 million hectares, probably higher than that now. The Great Green Wall Initiative is another one that has been on the table for a long time. So those are similar to those. I know Southern Africa is also going to do its own green wall as well. So those, then we also have the blue forest, the Great Blue Wall that we put forward as well. And so, yeah, those are large-scale nature-based solutions that we need to put forward. Thank you.
Good. Okay. Thank you so much, Alice. If anybody has any questions for Alice, feel free to put them into the chat. And then we'll move on to our second panelist, who is Lily Sanya. So it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Lily, who is the International Organization for Migration, which is also known as the IOM in the migration community. She is the Chief of Mission in South Africa, and we're very happy to have her here today to talk to us a little bit about the migration and displacement aspects of climate change, which are fundamental to a fundamental impact and survival mechanism and adaptation mechanism when it comes to climate change. So we look forward to hearing from you on this. Lily, welcome. My first question is going to be around the Loss and Damage Fund that we've already spoken about today. So this, I think, is one of the major developments that the migration community has really been focusing on this year. That's hopes that the Loss and Damage Fund becomes operational and that it does address migration and displacement. Can you speak a little bit about the loss and damage or other developments that you're looking for in the migration space when it comes to COP28?
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me. I think it's a flu season. I don't know if you can hear me.
You sound good. Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. You sound very good.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. So colleagues, it's a huge pleasure to be here with you. And I'm really glad to participate and put some ideas in this conversation. And I would like to center my conversation around people. You know, when we talk about this issue around climate change, we acknowledge that to a large extent, it does that to a large extent, it does affect people. And we who are living here on the continent have witnessed that impact. When we just think about numbers that have been affected when it comes to climate-induced disasters. In Southern Africa in particular, if we just look at the last 2 years, between 2021 and 2022, we've witnessed 5 cyclones in the Southern Africa region. You know, cyclones that have impacted countries in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe, where we have seen people displaced and people lose their lives. So in this conversation that we are having, I think it is important to note that as Africans on the continent, we have a huge stake in this conversation when it comes to the loss and damage fund in terms of where we should, where we should be, what we should see in terms of having a consensus. You'll all acknowledge with me that it took quite a lot of time for the transition committee to come to an agreement just in terms of even establishing the modalities. How should it look like? And as Brian indicated, I think it was almost like the transition committee scrambling towards the end to ensure that we get something to present. And of course, the big issue that the African countries have been saying is they should not be overly burdened, when it comes to this conversation around the funds. So what, for me, the big question that you've asked that is in my mind, will this really be approved at the COP28? I'm hoping that disputes around the implementation modalities do not come into play when this conversation happens at the COP28. I know that the issue of non-debt financing will come into play, and it also becomes quite contentious when you see the different interests. For instance, the conversation around who should fund, who should be involved in the funding. Developing countries have argued that they are the ones who have the least contribution to the global warming, so they should not be expected to fund. Also bringing in private sector, then also, the conversation around should they also be part of this funding mechanism, then brings in some new dimensions that may complicate the issue. So I'm also then hoping that when it comes to that discussion, we've talked about the summit in Nairobi that brought together African countries to have a common voice. So I'm really hoping that the developing countries, particularly Africa, will have a well-coordinated common voice when it comes to this conversation, so that they are able to articulate very clearly the critical links between building low-carbon, climate-resilient societies and sustainable development. Because again, these are really, really important because they are critical to addressing Africa's triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And we've talked about it by raising the point around our young population, who should be our demographic dividend. Then how do we ensure that we have a fund that contributes to investment towards building resilience to climate risk? The other thing that I would really want to see, that the fund will be easily accessible with less red tape, and most of all, not to plunge African countries into burdensome debt, so that they have the funding should not really increase the debt for the African countries. But most of all, I'm really hoping to see a shared commitment to protecting the planet, because then that way we also protect people, so that people do not have to unnecessarily move. So just listening to what the other colleagues have talked about, Brian raised it a lot, the issue of good faith will be very critical in this negotiation, so that we ultimately have a conversation that is framed around equity, fairness, and justice. Because ultimately, this is what we really hope to see, a world where we can contribute to development, and a world where we can have people's resilience built so that they do not move unnecessarily. And so, like in some of the work that we do, in our organization is really pushing for those kind of solutions, so that we are strengthening the capacity of communities then to stay, by strengthening either infrastructure or just helping to get people out of harm's way, particularly in times of either slow onset disasters that we see because of climate change, and some are sudden, like what we've seen recently in Libya, where we've seen cities wiped out. So I will stop here and hand it back to you, Noel.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that, Lily. I think those are some really good points. You focused quite a bit on the measures that are going to help people to stay, which is really important to prevent forced displacement. So that's a really important intervention to protect the rights and the ability for people to stay. But I work also in the migration space. So one of the common myths that we're constantly putting out in migration is that in the context of climate change, it's really a failure to adapt. But in fact, it is actually a really important adaptation measure that people can take that is developmental. Can you maybe just walk us through that framing and why migration and mobility are really important adaptation measures for people to adapt positively to climate change?
Thanks. Indeed, migration is also looked at. One could argue and look at it from different perspectives, but it can be used as an adaptation, strategy. And so I mentioned the point around either slow onset disasters or maybe sudden. But again, we bring in the element around having data and evidence, which then helps communities to be better prepared, where you know that at some point, because of the impact of climate, there may be a need to start planning better. Here we talk about even around planning new cities, or getting people to move before the disaster actually happens. And in Guy's presentation, he did give a map which helps us to visualize what the impact will be in particular areas at some point. And so in this kind of situations, when we have the data, we have the evidence, then we can plan to move people. And that is where we can see that migration can then serve as a way of getting people out of harm's way. I think we've also been talking a lot about some island states, and the conversation is also around them wondering really what is going to happen to them. Will they exist in the next several years? Should we be thinking of moving people from that kind of situation? So indeed, migration can, and of course, if we have the information, we can then use that to prepare better to get people out of harm's way.
Thank you very much for those remarks, Lily. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ngozi Amu, who's joining us from UNOWAS. She's led a regional UN program on climate change, peace, and security for West Africa and the Sahel for several years, and is currently working for the UN in South Sudan on risk management and conflict analysis. And we're very happy to have you join us today. I am really curious, based on your background, of course, and the work that you do, if you were able to give us a little context on something that we focus quite a lot on at the climate risk team here at ISS, and that is going to be central to the conversation at COP28, and that is the interconnectedness of climate change, security, and development, the nexus of security, development, and climate change, not only in West Africa and the Sahel, but on the continent. I'm curious what you think the role of regional collaboration and partnerships will be for effective climate action when it comes to this question. And of course, if you're able to also provide some of the priority outcomes that are top of mind and top of the list for you in terms of what we can hope to gain from the convenings this year.
Thank you very much, Ilan. Can you hear me? Very good. Well, I'm really delighted to join all of these excellent speakers, and I feel like I've learned a lot, and I will not repeat some of the information that's been provided. But in terms of West Africa and the Sahel, as you said, I've been leading in my previous position work that has focused on the integration of the UN system, working on development, peace, security, also human rights, and then climate change. And just to give some context in West Africa and the Sahel, I think it's important to talk about context too when we talk about climate change, because in West Africa and the Sahel right now, there are extreme challenges in terms of security. There is the terrorism threat. We've seen over the last couple of years an increase in military takeovers in many countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and others. There is political instability. And this is not only in this region, but in other regions in Africa too. And that means that when you think about climate adaptation and the financing that is needed to address these issues, you also have to take into consideration how to do this logistically and practically in places that are affected by conflict. So in West Africa and the Sahel is a region of about 400 million people, and it's expected to double by 2050. So there's also the issue about population increase. And then if you look at the Human Development Index in this region, you see that for some of the indicators like poverty, education, and others, the indicators show that not so much has changed, especially in countries that are considered the poor of the poor, and also have major other challenges. You also have the issue of the humanitarian crisis, which is related to the security problems I spoke about. So when you add climate change to this, that's why we often talk about climate change as a risk multiplier. It's adding another layer of stress to populations that are affected by other challenges. And so the international, we know that in terms of climate change impacts in this region, we're talking about the increase in heat, the temperatures, we're talking about flooding, we're talking about droughts, we're talking about sandstorms. And especially if you look at the region in the Sahel, just underneath the Sahara Desert, you realize that populations living in this region are the one most affected by these harsh conditions of already one of the driest places in the world. And so with the climate change impact, it's really putting some populations at the brink. Now, what I think makes this so worrisome is that the speed of climate change, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's the speed of climate change in this region is so high. And the ability of the countries to address these issues is still lagging behind. And we're talking about the national plans that exist, the national determined contributions, and so on. And I don't have the latest on how much that has been implemented, but it is obvious that there needs to be more support for government to be able to implement the national plans that already exist. So there is this combination of climate change, peace, security, and development, and that's important. And I think in the Nairobi Declaration during the Africa Climate Summit was so important, and I think it has all the ingredients in it to address some of these challenges, except the fact that when I talk about the insecurity, the terrorism, the government challenges, I don't think that there's enough emphasis placed on how to promote climate action in environments that are conflict affected. And I think that Dhesigen at the beginning of this seminar was speaking about the geopolitics of the world today. And one thing that really worries me is that we are living in this global crisis, which is both a crisis of conflict, but also a crisis of energy. Because if you look at the conflict in Ukraine and how that generated a crisis among European countries to look for energy sources elsewhere, the reliance that had been on Russia. And the fact that I think there was Gay who mentioned Professor Hansen and his recent paper published on climate change, the fact that fossil fuel production hasn't really resided. And so we're still in this conundrum of how in a world of war and in a world of energy dependence, because we all need energy for development and for our survival, how we're going to solve this issue. African countries, there are many African countries that have also been finding oil and gas in recent years. Many of them are saying, we have been waiting all this time to use our own resources, fossil fuel resources, for the development of our countries. And now we are being told by the developing world that, we should turn to green energy, which obviously is important. But that's also a real issue that has to be resolved about countries on the road to development that have had these oil and gas discoveries and the ability to promote development while instead prioritizing green energy. So those are some of the issues too I don't think have been put on the table as much as they should be in this discussion about the loss and damage fund, in the discussion about the funding for climate adaptation that Africa deserves, given the little that Africa as a continent contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's a lot of thinking around that. But I do want to end on a positive, point. And you were asking me to talk about why it's so important about a regional approach. So other colleagues have talked about the fact that climate change in many places where people are already living under difficult conditions are forcing people to relocate and migrate. And so there is this issue about where will people go and how will people receive and how can a sharing of natural resources be promoted so that there's a peaceful coexistence between them. And I think in our work in West Africa and the Sahel, in my previous position, we've seen that the youth are really doing amazing things in very difficult circumstances. We worked a lot with young entrepreneurs, young innovators who are looking at green energy, looking at solar panels, looking at recycling, the recycling industry, looking at using this as an opportunity. I said at the beginning that 60% of the population in West Africa and the Sahel are young people. There's this enormous resource available. And then on top of it, there are these enormous natural resources, including the sun that is shining everywhere. And so we need to not only focus on the loss and damage, but focus on how we can support young people in local communities that have ideas, are ready to do things, and help them to scale up this type of work so that it develop into businesses that can also have a regional and also international impact. And that's why the regional aspect is this concerns the whole region, the migration element, especially when people are forced to move across borders into other countries. And you have to have, and I know that ECOWAS already have a climate change strategy in this sense, but there's so much that has to be supported at different levels and at the same time. And that's why I think it's important to have that conversation to really emphasize that conversation at COP28, so that we can measure up. As someone said earlier, this is really about people, so that we can measure up to the populations that are most affected by climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks, Ngozi. I wanted to follow up on an incredibly important feature of the conversation that you've brought up, and this has to do with climate action in spaces where conflict is prevalent. We know that there might be this two-way relationship where conflict is exacerbating the effects of climate change, and that climate change, at least indirectly, might be driving conflict, especially around resources. I'm curious if there are any ideas at the forefront of this conversation. It's a link that I think is quite worrying, especially in parts of the continent that we've discussed, including the Sahel. Are there any strategies that we can employ or take to the forefront of our negotiating position ahead of COP28?
Yes, thank you for that. So in my previous position in West Africa and the Sahel, we, in April of 2022, brought together ministers in ECOWAS ministers of environment, ECOWAS ministers of foreign affairs, and also members of the UN Security Council, civil society, and people who are working in local environments in West Africa and the Sahel, and endorsed a call to action on climate change, peace, and security. And I know that my previous office is taking this call to action to COP28. They will have a series of side events. The call to action focuses on three aspects. One is the need for more evidence-based research. So if you're now talking about how to promote climate action in conflict-affected areas, you really need to talk to the populations themselves on how they see what should be addressed in that specific context. There's a need for more evidence-based research on how climate change impacts a specific environment, given the aspects that I've mentioned. There's the need for stronger partnerships. That's the second part of the call to action. And I think we've all on this panel have spoken about the importance of partnerships. I want to emphasize that these partnerships have to be both horizontal and vertical, which means that you have to have a dialogue between people who are at the local level, the national level, the regional level, and then linking it to the international. And that's, I guess, what COP28 stands for at the international level. But you need to make sure that that's informed about the realities that people are living on the ground. And then the third aspect of this call to action, which I encourage you to look at, is the need for financing. And I think the financing issue has been very well put on the table for the Nairobi Declaration. Again, as I said, financing is one aspect, but how to actually operationalize that in different contexts is another. And I think there are many different ideas of doing it. I think you have to combine dialogue and mediation with climate change expertise, with people who are working in the development field, with humanitarian actors. And so this idea of an integrated approach, I think, has never been more important when it comes to climate action for peace.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Ngozi. I think those are really important final words about partnership. And I would argue not just within the peace, but also just all around. I think that obviously the situation that we're facing calls for partnership, probably at levels that we haven't previously worked on and across different aspects of society that we haven't yet seen collaboration in, because, well, climate change is really permeating everything. I'm going to hand it over in a second back to Dhesigen to talk a little bit about the climate finance picture. But before I do that, I'm just going to give a small shameless plug for a publication that I am launching right now that speaks to the Loss and Damage Fund that we've heard a couple of people speak about in this session alone. It was one of the major outtakes of COP27 was the announcement that we're going to establish a Loss and Damage Fund. We've all watched or some of us on this call have watched the transitional committee try to form it and come up with some pretty fraught negotiations that are a bit worrying about whether or not the fund will actually launch and under what conditions. So we will be watching that closely. I am a migration researcher with the ISS, and I've put together a policy brief that argues that displacement and migration and mobility as a whole are really key components of loss and damage, and arguing for why it should be in the context of a shortage of funds and of competitive funds when it comes to the loss and damage fund once it does get established, that displacement should be a key consideration. And I make different recommendations for what should be included when looking at displacement, and it includes how to focus on vulnerable countries, and a lot of that focuses on using the right instruments and leaning away from debt. The finance that has flowed so far hasn't actually gone to the most vulnerable countries or to the most vulnerable people within those countries even. So there's still a lot of inequity in the finance and the adaptation funding that has flowed so far. I argue for gendered lenses as if in loss and damage, in displacement, and everything, as well as how important it is to prioritize children and youth who really suffer different impacts when it comes to climate-linked displacement and any forced displacement, really. And I argue also for the empowerment of local communities, local leaders in developing solutions and determining how loss and damage funding should be dispersed and is best going to be used. So I will put a link to it in the chat. Encourage people to take a look for it and to follow that development through COP28 and beyond, and really to hope see some good results from that. And with that, I will hand it over to Dhesigen. And Dhesigen, if you can just walk us through some of the architecture of the finance and what we can look for in COP28.
Thank you very much, Amy. We thought this might be useful to add on because two of our panelists haven't been able to join, and things happen. And we understand that. But I think the missing leg to the discussion is a bit of a deeper dive into some of the aspects around climate finance. So I'm not going to pretend to represent Shem. He's much more accomplished in this domain, and I'm certainly not talking on behalf of DFIs, but just some general observations that we need to carry into the climate finance discussions. And as all the speakers have mentioned, I mean, in the wish list that Alice put out earlier, climate finance, although she mentioned it later, was the key enabler to get any of the other things to happen. But my first point is that I don't think that we have a sufficient appreciation around some of the dynamics around climate finance. And in a world that continues to use competitiveness as the dominant paradigm that governs our global strategies, we have to understand that that dynamic plays itself out even in the climate change space. And the role that cheap energy plays inside that is gigantic. I mean, the reality is that the infrastructure around fossil fuels, as much infrastructure as you needed, has been paid a long time ago. And for many countries in the world that have access to those resources, it's just direct dividend time. It is the cheapest way to generate energy in general, and that energizes in turn your industrial pathways, and those industrial pathways determine your competitiveness in the world. And this is a narrative that plays itself out repeatedly. The additional parts of that narrative around what happens at the pressure points and how people react to the pressure points, if you like, unveils beyond the rhetoric what they actually depend on. So the big swing from major players in the renewable energy space, like the European Union, back to oil and coal and gas from imported gas, responding to the Ukraine crisis and the potential energy poverty of the European Union, is highly indicative of where the world currently is at. But I also want to point out that there are some pretty positive signs around it, because these major players in the system are also organizing for themselves to maintain that competitiveness, but now on a low carbon base rather than a high carbon base. Some would argue that at least one of those players, maybe more than one, are organizing for the new trade environment in the world to be skewed in the direction of being positive to climate change to maintain a competitive edge inside the system. I'll come to that in a moment. So if you look at these big movements, so one is the European Green Deal, which we know a good deal about, is Europe pegging its future in what the Shell scenarios call the green dream scenario, around maintaining that edge, but now on the back of renewable energy. And its directive mechanisms have been very pronounced. We have this repeated in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act investments in the United States, a unique bipartisan piece of legislation that's enabling the US to put a lot of government subsidy very directly into the switch to renewable energy in particular, but a low carbonization paradigm in general. Beyond that, if you look at India's renewable energy initiatives, and it's one of the fastest growing in the world, tells you that their 2070 net zero target is not only going to be realizable, it's going to be realizable way before that, and on an irreversible trend. And maybe the biggest investment of all is China. I mean, China currently in its 14th basic plan, which ends in 2025, is pegging 1,064 gigawatts of energy coming exclusively from solar and wind, in addition to all of the other options that are available. So you see that very big players in the world are organizing themselves in this direction. So the issue around the availability of climate-related finance might be a timetable issue. But, and this is really important and was raised by more than one of the speakers, maybe Lily expressed it most starkly, is that if we go according to that timetable where the big polluters, the big greenhouse gas emitters are ready to make the switch, we would not have changed the north-south inequality dynamic to a major degree. Still, the majority of the world, in terms of number of countries, would be on the poor side of that equation. And that discussion is not getting into the climate finance discussion in a tangible enough way. The next point I want to make around this thing is that, you know, on the African side, with an African lens, we do want to have an industrialization pathway, not to be globally competitive primarily, but to actually lift the vast numbers of people on this African continent out of poverty into the realization of things like SDG 1, SDG 2 around food security, and actually the whole suite. So that the SDG achievement around basic needs for Africans depends on a much more amplified industrialization strategy for the continent. We know we can't rely on 2063 anymore, because 2063 in turn was relying on this $10 trillion fossil fuel asset that we have on the continent in order to fund a major part of 2063's aspirations. We need 2063 2.0 now to engage with the low carbon pathway around us. We also want to realize the demographic dividend of the continent. And a bunch of folk have spoken about that already. Because the flip side of that coin is that if you don't have the youth usefully driving the economy, the alternative to the dividend is the burden, that we'll be sitting with a demographic burden. But I want to take this discussion beyond the perspective of the continent. And I'm constantly mesmerized by how the world is ignoring this. Because here are some fundamental realities. If that demographic dividend is not realized, this will not be a demographic burden only for the African continent. It will be a demographic burden for the world. Because if those young people cannot be gainfully absorbed in an inclusive low-carbon economy on the African continent, they're going to go elsewhere. I mean, the IOM is telling us that by 2100, 2 billion people will be in the category of forced mobility on the back of generally environmental degradation. A major, major contributor of that is, of course, climate change. The second thing that should be in the finance discussions, in the climate finance discussions, is that if forced to, African leaders will have to choose to use the fossil fuel asset that they have available to them in order to drive this development, to keep people out of poverty, to keep their countries and the continent out of de-development, because you can deteriorate really rapidly. And if Africa chose to do that, Africa would migrate from being a 4% contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions to a 40% contributor of GHGs. And if you think we're in trouble now because we're already talking about this interval between 1.5 degrees and 2.5 degrees, in the 40% emission scenario, we'll be talking about the difference between 5 degrees and 7 degrees above pre-industrial levels, at which point those high energy storms will be unbelievable, the floods will be unmanageable, the droughts will be unsurvivable, and so on and so forth. So I really think what we need to engage, and COP28 is a good platform to bring an awareness to the global community, both in the negotiations and outside the negotiations, is this realization that what you have available to you is an African continent that will be a global pilot for a low carbon future. And a very big part of that attractiveness is that it does not have to retrofit. It's a greenfield site. The flip side of the coin is if the globe does not do this collective investment, then we realize all of the negative aspects of not doing so. And that burden will not just be Africa's, it will be the world. And I think that's really important to emphasize. The last point I want to make is that we've had a really interesting experiment on financial collaboration between largely the North and the South, although it is expanding further elsewhere, where we've been talking about this notion of the JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. Now, there is one African country that is already signed up, and that's South Africa. There are 3 other African countries in negotiation, and there's a bunch of African countries that have expressed an interest inside this. We now need to be talking to the other subset that we need, and that is the Just Adaptation and Resilience Investment Partnership, the JAR-IP. We need to be talking to both northern and the better resourced southern partners who are now part of new formations like BRICS around what this can mean for the African continent. And this is quite pivotal. And what we should be looking at here are 2 sides of this coin. One is there's an investment side to make us more climate resilient. Because all of the interventions that you talked about, all hinged on a certain level of injection of capital to get us to a higher resilience index to deal with where we are at, and hopefully to organize for a low carbon future. I don't like using the word decarbonize when we're talking about Africa. I would rather say that Africa needs to operate within its current carbon budget as best it can around its development. But the other side of this coin is that if we don't, the cost of the system will be completely unmanageable. So the design of the financial instruments, the design of the architecture of engagement around finances have some very core foundational points in things like the Bridgetown Agenda. We need to make that much more visible in the climate discussions inside COP28 and COP29 and COP30 and all the way forward, empowering the global goal for adaptation, empowering the loss and damage fund, empowering the Sendai framework, in addition to the mitigation agenda that we clearly need to stick to. The very last point I will make, I'm not sure if you can hear that, but the very last point I want to make around this is that we need to use multiplicity of bridges for this to happen. You know, in the absence of direct ODA, which is becoming more and more rare over time, we need to be looking at the DFIs as a bridging mechanism. And that discussion was a pretty difficult one in the transitional arrangements for the loss and damage fund, and they'll be repeated in other domains. But we also need to be looking at philanthropies who are getting much, much more interested in climate change matters as we are moving forward, as part of those bridging mechanisms to get us that financial flow in the system that we want to see. So, Chair, let me pause at that point, because I've got some competing sounds around me, and hopefully we can have a really good discussion around all of the terrific issues that have already been raised by all of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Des. I think it was an important addition to the conversation to have a look not only at the climate finance question, but also at the greater context for this discussion overall. I'm curious if Guy or you, Des, would be open to directly answering a question that was brought up earlier by Brian and by Guy, and this has to do with the carbon credits and the risks associated with them. Can you say more about what those risks are precisely and how exactly an African position can fortify itself against those risks as that conversation takes on more and more traction?
I'll be happy to, if Guy is not on. He's done a lot of work in this domain, and I would be largely quoting his work, to be honest. Is he still on the call? In which case, let me start, and maybe you can join and add. I mean, there was a bunch of components associated with this that are absolutely critical. Now, one of the things that COP27 did is that it has finalized the rules for Article 6, which governs how carbon markets can operate, right? And on the back of that, you have seen a flurry, an absolute flood of investment gestures from high carbon countries, high carbon economies, to try and realize their net zero targets on the back of these carbon credits. There's a bunch of things associated with that that are extremely negative overall. One is that you're not actually reducing the emissions. You're trading off the emissions, and this is a big problem. Two, you're maintaining the current balance of power of developed countries versus developing countries, because the countries that have the high carbon are maintaining their high carbon activity, and they're buying away from the developing countries their own possibility of using those credits around their own development. And that's a really big problem. The third one, and Guy's research has shown this, that the negative impacts on local communities is becoming increasingly apparent. People have been using some difficult words, and I know there are difficult phrases out there, but they are sounding like they might be true. For example, in Mozambique, people are now talking about these carbon market schemes as land grabs, where people have lived in a place for sometimes centuries, as has been the example in Mozambique, being actually moved out, and you are now restricted about any development activity because that asset, that ecological asset, that carbon sequestration asset can now not be touched. And it's bizarre. The other thing that is very difficult is that the current trading regime is restricted to high carbon countries being the ones that can buy the asset. So if you use a local example inside Africa, the DRC can't use its vast rainforest assets to bet against, if you like, around allowing some measure of high carbon development to get its economy moving. But a country like South Africa can buy that asset. And so it starts to get really unfair. And then there's the issue about what the limits to this are. And this is where it starts falling off the slope. So carbon markets in general as a core concept is not a bad one. But the two things that must be there alongside that is that it has to have as part of its criteria what the implications are of the selling country or the selling region. And that must be a big part of the discussion. And the second big thing around it is that clearly this is a time-based issue, that at some point in the very near future, you will actually exhaust the asset, at which point this carbon trading mechanism for new assets actually has to stop. So, Chair, that's my contribution. I think Guy would have done a lot better.
Thank you very much, Des. It was a fantastic contribution. I have just one final question, and I think we can turn to Sagal for the concluding remarks. And this is a question to any of the panelists. And that is, we've spoken quite a bit about the importance of adaptation, but there's also a crucial question about the importance of figuring out exactly how to address the costs of adaptation. And this is a question brought up earlier in the discussion by Brian when he turned to us and he asked, how can we develop economic incentives for adaptation actions? I'm making an impossible ask, but for the panelists, is there a way that we can address this question as succinctly as possible, just to have something to think about as we move into the concluding remarks?
I think we Lily has had to go. I don't know. Alice, are you still on the call, or have we lost Alice as well?
Perhaps it's a question that we take home with us. How can we develop economic incentives for adaptation measures? I'm looking at the clock and we're running out of time. This is, I think, something that's going to continue to come up. And as we take a look as well at Amy Noel's recent publication, I think there's much to think about moving forward from this conversation. Dhesigen, I'll turn to you for the introduction of Sagal.
Yes, happy to do so. I do see that we have eaten up a little bit of a time. My apologies to her for that in advance. Colleagues, we have the benefit of having Sagal Abshir to help us with some closing remarks. There are two designations of hers that I want to highlight. One is she is connected to the ISS. She's part of the advisory board to the Institute for Security Studies. But she is also the head of a very new climate and security unit inside UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program. And we are looking to her to guide many of the issues that we have raised today to a higher level of both information as well as mechanisms to organize for us to put that into practice in reality. So, Sagal, we are turning to you to try and summarize what have been a very rich set of presentations and look forward to your closing remark.
Thank you so much, Des, and thank you for having me here. And greetings, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I am dialing in from Nairobi today, and will, like someone had said earlier, I'm talking sort of in my private capacity. And I do have the almost impossible task of summarizing a conversation that is incredibly rich and incredibly far-reaching. But, any faults in it and anything is my summary and not the speakers who actually initially spoke. So I'll say that upfront as a caveat. We started the conversation, I think, with Dhesigen's setting the scene of the background of this COP, the background of our world today, of course, is a turbulent world that is facing multiple crises, including conflict, including economic crisis, and of course, this climate crisis. At the same time, we're going into this COP knowing that the world has not met the targets and the promises and the commitments made. And I think that that's an interesting one. I think, you know, the sense might have been there at other COPs, but this is the first official global stocktake. And as many people have noted, the results are grim. And so what does it mean to go into a, you know, the world coming together to have that conversation, and what does it look like? And I want to pick up on, you know, I think that we've heard today a mixture of both optimism, but also a kind of sober, pragmatic realism, especially when talking about this effort of responding to the climate action. I think it was Guy who said this is a team game. And I think that there was also, we've heard, you know, questions around the good faith or goodwill of all the people showing up to this conversation at COP28 and every day, really. So sort of as that background, let me just talk about sort of the main topics that came up today. I think, you know, the setup for this session today is, you know, what should we expect at COP28? And I think what should Africa sort of seek? Obviously, to try to make sure the mitigation goals are met. We heard a lot about what the implications are, the current impacts that are already being felt on the continent. And of course, it's only going to get worse as the temperatures rise and as we fail to take the action. So I think very strongly we heard today that, you know, it is going to be important for greater ambitions. Alice laid out some really very optimistic and very, very ambitious goals. A successful global stocktake, stronger NDCs that we're going to see, phasing out of fossil fuels. You know, this is something that, you know, we're going to have to seek. I think we, you know, on the other side of it, again, in this balancing of optimism and also realism, was Brian's maybe warning or a note to make sure that these responsibilities are equally shared and not transferred from north to south. And so as we look forward, that when we try to strengthen the mitigation goals and continue to commit and continue to believe that we're going to do the right thing, let's make sure also that it's negotiated in the right way. I think an interesting thing about mitigation, Des just touched on it, but also Guy, this concept of mal-mitigation and making sure that we're actually not making things worse will be an important one, especially when it comes to some of the afforestation plans and of course some of this carbon schemes around the world. On the topic of adaptation, we need more of it. And I think that that's going to be another big theme, of course, of what Africa is going to debate for. Big and bold on adaptation, and also making it make economic sense. How are we going to do that? UNEP's adaptation gap report just recently came out, and I think the worrying thing there is not only is the current adaptation inadequate, but it's decelerating. And that curve, of course, needs to be changed. It needs to start to go in the other way. I think in addition to the issue of quantity, of course, we must look at quality. An important conversation around adaptation is not just rehatting business as usual development as adaptation, but really using the science that we have out there and at our hands and making sure we're doing that work. The other big thing, of course, is financing. And we've talked about it in lots of different ways. I think whether it's adaptation financing or whether it's financing in this new modality, the Loss and Development Fund. which is absolutely important. I think, as Lily had said, it has to be easily accessible and not result in greater amounts of debt. But I think can we do some of these things? Dhesigen's really provocative question. Can we change the narrative from financing to investment and a collective investment for the world, right? And the financing that's coming to the developing countries being seen as everyone's investment. Are we going to see any big announcements at COP? I think Brian's suggestion, on one side of the spectrum, is that it's not ripe, but ultimately this will be one of the things that will be sought. And as Lily said, hopefully there's a well-coordinated African position on this. I want to pick up quickly on some of the comments of Ngozi on climate and security and the linkages there, which is an important one. This is the area that I spend a lot of my time in. And the theme I want to highlight there in the summary is really the importance of partnership and integrating work across the different communities, whether that's the peace and security world or the climate action world or even the development world. This is a topic that is, of course, going to only increase, especially as we fail to meet our targets, and especially as some of the pathways that have been identified by the science, whether it's through threats to food and water security, or whether it's mobility. And I want to acknowledge the points around mobility being a positive adaptation thing, but how can, unplanned mobility or migration or movement in response to some of these more sudden onset issues? All of these pathways have been shown to possibly lead to or contribute to worsening conflicts. And in the theme of this Africa's leadership on this, one point to make about COP28 is, for the first time, we're going to have a full thematic day dedicated to this topic of peace. I think it's called the Relief, Recovery and Peace Day on December 3rd. And there will be a call for greater support and greater partnership on climate action in some of these fragile and conflict-affected states. And one of the things that will be showcased is the IGAD, a new IGAD regional climate security mechanism. This was something that the heads of state endorsed in June 2023. And this is a mechanism to build the capacity of IGAD member states to anticipate, prevent, and mitigate the outset of any climate-induced conflict and displacement. And why this is notable is this is the first sort of member state organization of a regional nature, I'd say, in the world. And so when we talk about Africa's leadership and leading the agenda of some of these issues, this is one of the things that will be showcased that will be very interesting and something to watch out for. That's December 3rd. Another strong theme that came out is this idea of centering of people. And our demographic dividend, the youth, and a very strong call, I think, for education, awareness, and capacity building. And I think this is an important one as we go into a multilateral, global, international level event where, I think Guy said, we're negotiating with each other, but not with nature. It's important to remember that ultimately people are at the center of this. And for this continent, it's mostly the youth. I'm just going to close again, as we balance this idea of sort of a sober and quite dismal situation, we still have to go into it with a certain level of optimism and goodwill. And I think to the question posed at the very beginning, does the multilateral system work? I think the answer is we have to make it work. And I think that's the spirit of this COP28. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I know you had an almost impossible task and you did it so incredibly well. Colleague, what remains for me to do is to thank everybody for your attendance. And I'm sure you'll agree with me that the speakers have been absolutely brilliant. And we are promising as the ISS that we will have a post-COP engagement as well. We've expressed our aspirations, we expressed our anxieties, we've expressed our hopes. Let's talk about what we do with the results after the COP. Thank you all very much indeed.